Pokemon is such a thing. It's been around for a pretty long time now, which is weird, remembering when something was new, and now it is old. It is quite old. And so it's really weird to just imagine back when it wasn't as much of a thing yet, and the companies, doing it, publishing it, didn't really quite know what to do with it. It doesn't happen as much these days, but especially back then, games would be altered and repackaged and marketed in very, very different ways in different territories. Sometimes they would have to make major changes to a game to be confident at all that it was going to sell in a territory. Smaller examples being like making Kirby look mad on the box art, but like there were times when entire games were changed. And so it's funny to imagine that there was once a time when Nintendo of America was trying to figure out, how can we change Pokemon completely to repackage it for the American audience, or rather for the Western audience, pretty much any audience outside of Japan? Well, Gail Tilden used to work for Nintendo of America as a marketing executive, and she recently did an interview with the Video Game History Foundation, and she had a lot of really, really interesting stuff to say about the process of getting Pokemon to us here in the West, way back in, 1998. She starts by saying, "So in January of 1998, I was asked if I would lead the team to bring Pokemon out of Japan to the rest of the world, other than China and Korea. Prior to me getting involved that directly as team lead, we had all seen the game, a black and white RPG on Game Boy with very Japanese characters. And then our ad agency said, could we just change the art and it'll be like gritty and we'll make graffiti on the walls and stuff like that." Now that's already very funny. That's already like Pokemon was just hitting the scene, and it's probably starting to catch on, but they're looking at the game and it's not always easy to spot genius. It's not always easy to look at something and really register how big of a deal it's going to be and how much it's going to resonate with people. So I can definitely see, especially back then, even the late 90s was still like the Wild West of video games. Nobody knew what games were gonna do well. It was really just kind of anything goes. So yeah, they're looking at this little black and white Game Boy game with just very weird Japanese characters. And I can see why. They're like, I don't know if this is gonna work, especially the 90s. The 90s, we had very strong ideas of what was popular. If it wasn't riding a skateboard with a backwards baseball cap and sunglasses, we didn't want nothing to do with it. And that's why I can definitely understand. Can we change the art and it'll be like gritty and we'll make graffiti on the walls and stuff? I could see that. That's such a 90s thing. It's like New York city streets. It's graffiti. It's skateboards. It's a little more gritty, a little more street, That was like the go-to aesthetic. If you wanted to at least imagine that kids were gonna like your thing, that's what you go to. So yeah, it's interesting because like how far would they have been willing to go to make these changes? Would they just like get into the game's files and literally just put graffiti on the walls? Like how much are you actually going to change? Because for a Game Boy game, Pokemon was really quite complex. It was really quite a big game with a lot of systems in place. So I really don't know. But then it gets a little more interesting. There was also a thought like, is the way that the game is formatted, could we make it that they're all baseball players in a baseball league, but not like a Pokemon league? Yeah, you heard right. There was at least one point where they were considering turning Pokemon into some sort of baseball game, some sort of baseball RPG. And we don't really know how seriously this idea was thrown around. We don't know if it was like they were drawing up concept art, they were getting ready to do it, or if this was just one of the ideas that was thrown around. We can't know for sure, but it seems that at the very least it was considered. Can we take Pokemon and turn it into baseball? Baseball! Of all things, how are you doing that? How are you taking these 150 monsters? Are you turning them into baseball players? Are the Pokemon still the Pokemon, but they're playing baseball? What, instead of fight? I don't know. It's a completely different game. That's a completely different game. I have no idea. And you know, we have seen plenty of cases throughout history, again, especially back then, less now, if any, of taking a concept, of taking an IP, and really just doing a completely new version of it. It could be that they weren't even going to take the original files and do anything with them. They were just going to just take like just the name or like some of the iconography or something and just give us something completely different, like Doki Doki Panic style of just like, I don't know, let's just take a different game and bring it over and slap some different skins on it. I really don't know. But I find it very, very interesting, especially for Pokemon. Again, we know what happened with Pokemon. We know that Pokemon was perfect, was simply perfect all by itself. It did not need any fine tuning or westernizing in any way, but very, very fortunately, I mean, I can't imagine what this present day would look like if they didn't just lean into Pokemon as Pokemon. But yeah, apparently they kind of figured out that they needed to just let it be what it was. She goes on to say, as all this discussion and meetings were going on for a few months, Pokemon was heating up and heating up. Now there's TV shows, now there's comic books, now they get, you know, movies and more games and toys. And so finally, Mr. Arakawa said, forget it. We're just doing it. We're doing it. And not only we're doing it, we're going to do it all. We're doing the whole thing. We want control of the whole thing. And so we need all the rights gathered up in Japan, and we want all the rights given to Nintendo of America. And we had a licensing agency we worked with, which was 4Kids. And so we're going to work with them, and we're going to make sure that it's done the way it was in Japan, and we're going to make sure we can control everything. And yeah, ultimately, it was the right move. It turns out these kids, they like the weird Japanese stuff. That was like, I remember, I mean, at the risk of turning into a whole entire tangent, I remember feeling that disconnect, even as a kid, looking at like the stuff that our parents and older generations liked, and then looking at stuff that they were trying to make for us, and seeing that it still had a very like old-fashioned, westernized kind of, I don't know, kind of sensibilities. And like the whole like Japanese influence, they just did not get it at all. You know, like Japanese stuff in particular was just absolutely baffling to anyone older than us. So I can really, really understand where they were coming from. And it's just that like, yeah, the media companies were not really getting that this stuff had really wide appeal. It was just appealing to this new generation. And so they absolutely made the right choice by just leaning into it. Because it is true, even just from a business standpoint. If in Japan you've already got all this stuff, and the toys, and the movies, and everything, like, yeah, it's too much of a hassle to try to retool the entire thing for a different audience. It's so much easier to just localize, you know, just take everything you have and just localize it, and they did. And now we have Pokemon, and now Pokemon is what it is today, which I will always find strange. I will never stop being surprised that Pokemon is bigger today than it was back then, because the craze was just, it was crazy. It was just like, Pokemania was such a massive thing back then that it's hard to believe that it's even bigger now. But it does make sense, because all of those kids grew up. And then more kids got in, and then more kids, and then just like generation after generation, it just kind of seems to be growing. There are simply more humans on this earth who enjoy Pokemon. But yeah, there you go. That's the story. Pokemon may have almost become a baseball RPG. All right, sure. Kind of reminds me of that other well-known piece of video game history, you know, the original Donkey Kong. It wasn't originally going to star Mario and Donkey Kong. It was originally going to be an adaptation of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. But that, you know how it goes. They couldn't get the rights to the characters. I made that joke off the cuff, and now I'm actually thinking about what it would actually mean, and I have to stop thinking about it and just end the video.